Welcome to True Crime Threads. Today, a tragic story of love turned deadly. Isla had always imagined that her life would follow a different path, one where her choices would shape her future, where love would blossom freely, and where she would marry for the right reasons. But when her parents arranged her marriage to Asher, a man she barely knew, her dreams felt like they were slipping away. They had chosen him because of his wealth and social status, not because he had won her heart. Isla had no say in the matter. Her parents had told her that Asher was the ideal match, that he was kind, successful, and from a respectable family. But all Isla could see was a man she didn't know, someone who would dictate her life, someone whose world she would have to enter without question. The wedding day arrived with an overwhelming sense of dread. The house was filled with flowers, and everything was meticulously planned, but Isla could hardly breathe as she stood before the mirror. The dress fit perfectly, but it felt more like a uniform than a symbol of love. She had spent weeks trying to convince herself that everything would be fine, that maybe she would learn to love him. But deep down, she knew the truth that love wasn't something that could be forced. Isla had always been a free spirit. She loved to spend time with her friends, to explore the world on her own terms. She had hopes and dreams that didn't align with the life her parents had mapped out for her. But their pressure had been relentless. They told her that this was how things were done, that this was her duty, her responsibility. And so she resigned herself to the idea that her happiness didn't matter as much as the expectations of others. Her future had been decided long before she was given a chance to choose it. When she first met Asher, she had been struck by how perfect he seemed. He was tall, handsome, and well-spoken, a man who carried himself with confidence. He had an air of sophistication, the kind of man people admired. He had the life Isla's parents had always wanted for her wealth, power, and status. But as they spoke more, Isla began to feel a growing sense of unease. Asher wasn't unkind, but he was distant, cold even. There was no spark, no excitement. He didn't make her laugh, nor did he seem particularly interested in getting to know her. Their conversations were stiff, full of pleasantries, but lacking in any depth. It was as though they were two strangers simply going through the motions, pretending that something real could come from it. The wedding was an extravagant affair, held in a grand ballroom with sparkling chandeliers and elaborate decorations. Guests from all over the city gathered, their faces filled with smiles and admiration, but Isla could hardly focus on them. All she could think about was how much she wanted to escape, how much she longed to walk out the door and never look back. But it wasn't an option. She was trapped. The ceremony went on without incident, with Isla saying her vows as though she were reading from a script. Asher stood beside her, his face unreadable, his eyes cold. The whole experience felt like a dream, a bad one. After the vows were exchanged and the celebrations began, Isla found herself smiling and nodding, playing the role of the perfect bride. But deep inside, she felt like she was suffocating. Asher smiled politely, but there was no warmth in it. His attention was directed toward his business partners and colleagues, leaving Isla to navigate the social world of their guests alone. She realized as the night wore on that this was how her life would be from now on, isolated, controlled, and empty. She had promised herself that she would make the best of it, that maybe things would improve once the honeymoon period passed. But even then, she couldn't shake the feeling that the life she had dreamed of was slipping further and further away. Her marriage wasn't one of love, it was a transaction, a business arrangement. Isla's heart ached with the reality of it all. As the night drew to a close, and she stood beside Asher for photos, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her own dreams, crushed beneath the expectations of others. She had been married, but she hadn't been chosen. Her freedom had been taken, and in its place she was left with a life she hadn't asked for. And as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something far darker than she could ever have imagined. In the weeks that followed the wedding, Isla's life began to feel more like a dream she couldn't wake up from. The house she now shared with Asher, a grand but cold mansion on the outskirts of town, felt empty and unfamiliar. It wasn't the home she had imagined for herself, filled with love and warmth, but rather a place where she was constantly on edge, watching her every move, afraid to make a mistake. Asher's presence loomed over every room, his coldness seeping into the very walls. Isla quickly realized that her new life was nothing like what she had hoped for. There were no romantic gestures or tender moments between her and Asher. Instead, he seemed to exist in a world of his own, a world where Isla was merely an accessory, a trophy wife to be paraded at events. When he was home, his attention was often consumed by his work, his phone, or his business deals. He would sit in the study, staring at his laptop for hours, while Isla wandered the halls, trying to fill the silence with anything that felt normal. But nothing did. She had no real friends in the city. Her old circle had been left behind, and Asher discouraged her from making new ones. Most days, Isla tried to find small distractions to ease her loneliness. She would read books, take long walks through the neighborhood, or spend hours in the kitchen experimenting with recipes, hoping to fill the void that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But the silence in the house was deafening. At night, when Asher finally retired to their bedroom, he would close himself off, lying on his side of the bed as if Isla were a stranger to him. There was no intimacy, no connection. She had been promised companionship, a partner to share her life with, but instead she found herself more isolated than ever. Asher's dominance over her life grew stronger by the day. He began to control the smallest details of her existence: what she ate, what she wore, even who she could talk to. Isla felt like a prisoner in her own home. If she dared to question him or challenge his authority, the consequences were immediate and severe. He would become distant, cold, and condescending, punishing her with his silence. It was as if he was waiting for her to slip up, to fail in some way, so he could remind her of her place in his life. At first, Isla tried to keep up appearances, hoping that things would get better with time. She even convinced herself that maybe she was overreacting, that this was just how marriage was supposed to be. But the more she tried to ignore the growing discomfort in her chest, the more it became clear that she was living in a world of control and submission. One evening, she tried to make small talk with Asher over dinner, attempting to break the thick tension that always seemed to hang between them. She asked about his day, about the projects he was working on, but his responses were short and dismissive. He barely looked up from his plate, his mind clearly elsewhere. Isla tried to speak to him again, but her voice seemed to fall on deaf ears. The more she tried, the more frustrated she became, and she couldn't help but wonder if he even cared about her at all. After dinner, when they retreated to the living room, Asher turned on the television, ignoring her entirely. He would spend the evenings lost in his own world, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture in the room. Isla sat there, helpless, watching as he remained consumed by his phone and television, never sparing her a glance. She realized then that this wasn't just a bad phase, it was a reality she was going to have to face every day for the rest of her life. But Isla still held on to a small sliver of hope, a belief that perhaps eventually Asher would soften, that he would see her as more than just a decoration. She convinced herself that maybe he was just busy, that maybe the pressure of his career had caused him to retreat into himself. She tried to remain patient, even as the cracks in her hope began to widen. Her dreams of a life filled with love and laughter were slowly slipping away, and in their place, she found herself drifting further into the shadows of her own existence. She had been married to Asher for only a few months, but already, Isla was beginning to feel like she had lost herself. The woman she had been before the wedding seemed like a distant memory, her spirit gradually fading in the wake of a life she hadn't chosen. But she still clung to the faint hope that things might change, that somehow, somewhere, she could find the strength to make it work. Little did she know, the darkness surrounding her would only grow, and the life she had been forced into would soon become even more suffocating than she could ever have imagined. The days turned into weeks, and Isla's sense of isolation grew deeper. The house, with its empty rooms and grand but soulless decor, became a constant reminder of how little control she had over her own life. Asher's behavior, once a quiet nuisance, had now evolved into something far darker. He was no longer just emotionally distant, he had become increasingly irritable, unpredictable, and cruel. Isla learned to tiptoe around him, to speak in soft tones and avoid eye contact when he was in one of his moods. It was as if every day was a guessing game. Would he be in a good mood, or would he lash out at the smallest thing? One night, after a long day of silence between them, Asher returned home late, his face clouded with frustration. He barely acknowledged Isla as he walked past her, slamming the door to the study behind him. The tension in the air was palpable, and Isla felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. She had learned to dread the sound of the study door closing, for it was usually a sign that something was wrong. The weight of his anger would hang over the house, and Isla would be forced to tiptoe around it, never knowing what might set him off. When he finally emerged hours later, his mood had not improved. He barely looked at her as he walked through the hallway, muttering something about a stressful day. Isla felt a pang of hurt in her chest. It had been so long since they had shared any real connection, and now it seemed like he barely remembered she was there. She had tried to keep the peace, to make things easier, but nothing ever seemed to change. Asher's increasing temper was becoming harder to ignore. One evening, after she had prepared his dinner, he suddenly became enraged when she asked him if he wanted more wine. His response was quick, harsh, and unexpected. He snapped at her, accusing her of being incompetent, of not understanding the things he needed. Isla, startled, stepped back, her heart racing in her chest. She hadn't meant anything by the question. It was just a simple gesture, a way of trying to connect with him, to show that she cared. But in that moment, all she saw was his anger. His eyes, once so calm and controlled, were now filled with fury. He stood there, towering over her, his breath shallow, his face reddening with rage. The room was silent except for the sound of Isla's quickening breath. She could feel the weight of his gaze on her, a pressure that seemed to press against her chest, making it hard to breathe. He took a step toward her, and for a moment Isla froze, paralyzed by fear. But then, just as quickly as the outburst had begun, it stopped. Asher turned away and walked out of the room, his steps heavy and deliberate. Isla stood there, her body trembling, unsure of what had just happened. Was this something she could have prevented? Was she to blame for making him angry? The emotional scars from that evening were far deeper than she had expected. Over the following days, she could still feel the burn of his words, the sharpness of his gaze. She tried to act normal, to carry on as though everything were fine, but the wound in her chest refused to heal. Each time she looked at him, each time he ignored her or treated her with disdain, she felt a piece of herself die inside. In the following weeks, the tension in the house only grew. Asher's outbursts became more frequent and intense, and Isla found herself walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set him off next. She began to wonder if this was what her life would always be, a constant cycle of his unpredictable moods, her attempts to please him, and the silence that followed. She had once believed that things might improve, that this cold, detached man could become the husband she had hoped for. But now she was beginning to fear that this was the man he truly was, a man who ruled with anger, who saw her not as an equal partner, but as an extension of his will. One night, after another long day of avoiding his wrath, Isla sat alone in their bedroom, the curtains drawn to block out the night. She had tried to reach out to Asher, to make things right, but it seemed like everything she did only made him more distant. The loneliness she had felt in the beginning had now turned into something darker, something suffocating. She couldn't escape it. No matter how much she tried to smile, to show him that she was there for him, it never made a difference. She felt invisible, as if she were living in a world where her presence didn't matter. Isla began to realize that she had fallen into a trap of her own making. She had entered this marriage with the hope that things would get better, that Asher would change, that love would somehow blossom between them. But the reality was far from what she had imagined. She had been pushed to the edges of her own life, forced to live in a world of fear, uncertainty, and emotional neglect. Her dreams of a happy marriage, of a life built on love and companionship, seemed more distant with every passing day. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to leave. The pressure from her parents, from society, to make her marriage work was too great. She was stuck, unable to move forward or backward, trapped in a life she had never chosen. Isla's world had shrunk to a cage of her own making, and the walls were closing in tighter with every passing day. The facade she had built, pretending everything was fine, was becoming harder to maintain. The anger, the coldness, the emotional manipulation, it was all beginning to feel like a suffocating fog, one that no amount of effort could clear away. Asher's behavior had escalated, and it was no longer just verbal lashings or silent treatment that she endured. He had begun to show a darker side, one she had never anticipated when she first agreed to this marriage. There were times, now, when Isla would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart racing, drenched in sweat, from a dream she couldn't remember clearly but knew to be a warning. The fear that had been a quiet undercurrent in the first months of their marriage had now turned into a constant presence, following her everywhere she went. Even when she managed to gather the strength to leave the house for a few hours, to take a walk or visit a store, she never felt truly free. Asher had a way of making her feel guilty for taking time for herself, as though everything she did was a betrayal. He started to micromanage her in ways that were subtle at first but soon grew more overt. He would demand to know where she was going, who she was talking to, and what she was doing when he wasn't around. It was as though he couldn't stand the idea of her existing outside the bubble he had created for her. The control wasn't just emotional anymore, it had become physical, too. He had insisted she quit her job, telling her that she didn't need to work because he could provide for everything. Isla had resisted at first, but she soon realized that he wasn't asking. He was telling her. And the consequences of defiance, she had learned, were far worse than simply agreeing to his demands. Isla had spent weeks wrestling with the decision, but eventually she left her job. There was no more independence, no more feeling like she had a purpose outside of him. The more she gave in to his requests, the more he demanded. His smiles, once charming, now felt hollow and patronizing. The warmth she had once seen in him was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating persona that wore the mask of a loving husband, but underneath, Isla could feel the darkness growing stronger. One night, as they sat at the dinner table, Isla noticed something unsettling in Asher's eyes. They were colder than usual, harder. It was as if he was studying her, searching for any sign of rebellion. He didn't speak for a long while, just staring at her as she nervously picked at her food. When he finally broke the silence, his voice was low, clipped. "You've been slipping," he said, his words hanging heavy in the air. "I told you that I didn't want you talking to anyone. You think I don't know about your little phone calls." Isla's heart skipped a beat. She had been so careful, trying to keep her interactions outside the house minimal, but it wasn't enough. Asher had found out, and now she felt the full weight of his wrath descending upon her. "I was just checking in with my friend," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's nothing." "Nothing," Asher repeated, a dark laugh escaping his lips. "You think I'm stupid, Isla? Don't you dare lie to me." The room was charged with tension, and Isla could feel her pulse racing. She had learned to stay silent during these moments, to try and ride out his anger without giving him any more reason to lash out. But this time it felt different. She could feel his eyes burning into her, a fire that threatened to consume her. "You need to understand something," Asher continued, his voice now a low growl. "You belong to me. Don't forget that." The words were like a slap across her face, and for the first time in a long while, Isla felt a cold shiver of fear run down her spine. She tried to keep her composure, to swallow the lump in her throat, but it was impossible. The realization of her situation was overwhelming. She had no escape, no way out. Every attempt to make a life for herself had been met with more control, more manipulation. She was drowning, and Asher was the one holding her under. For the rest of the evening, they didn't speak. Isla sat in silence, trying to absorb the full weight of what had just been said. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, trapped in a gilded cage. The house was beautiful, but it was nothing more than a cage built to hold her in place, a place where she couldn't escape, even if she wanted to. Her mind raced, desperately trying to find a way out, but the thought of leaving him, of breaking free, was terrifying. She had no money, no resources. The world outside seemed so distant, so unreachable. Days passed, and Isla's desperation grew. She had tried to reach out for help in small, subtle ways, sending a text to a friend, dropping hints to acquaintances, but each time, she was met with silence. Asher had made sure of that. He had woven a web of control so tight around her that she couldn't breathe without his permission. Even if she tried to call for help, no one would come. Isla's world had become a prison, and the more she tried to resist, the more she realized that her chances of escaping were slipping away. She felt like a shell of the woman she once was, trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. It was late one evening when Isla felt the final shift in her world, the moment where everything she had feared finally came to fruition. The weight of the years of manipulation, emotional abuse, and control had taken its toll on her. The fear, the isolation, the loneliness, everything had built to this point. Asher had become increasingly erratic, his temper unpredictable, and his need to dominate her unrelenting. The tension in the house had become unbearable, and tonight it felt like the breaking point. Isla had tried to be cautious, avoiding any actions that might trigger him. She had learned to read his moods, to walk on eggshells around him, but tonight something was different. Asher was angry, more than usual. The reason, Isla wasn't sure. It might have been something small, a misplaced item, or a comment she had made that didn't sit right with him, but it didn't matter. His rage had already consumed him, and Isla felt herself shrinking beneath the weight of his gaze. She sat at the edge of the sofa, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, trying to stay still, trying not to provoke him further. Asher stood across from her, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed with that familiar coldness. There was a dangerous stillness to him, a quiet before the storm that Isla knew all too well. "Why can't you just listen?" he spat, his voice low but menacing. "Why can't you just do as I say for once?" Isla opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her lips. She had learned long ago that anything she said would only make things worse, so she remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the pressure of his stare, like a heavy weight on her chest. She had never felt more trapped in her life. Then, without warning, Asher moved toward her, his hands reaching for her throat in one swift motion. The shock of it was overwhelming. Isla gasped, her hands flying to his wrists, but his grip was unyielding, his fingers tightening around her neck with a force she hadn't anticipated. Her body froze in terror as she struggled to breathe, her vision beginning to blur at the edges. Her hands pushed against his chest, trying desperately to pry him off, but he was too strong. She could feel her pulse pounding in her temples, each beat a reminder that she was running out of time. Her body began to convulse, her limbs weakening, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around her seemed to spin, her thoughts scattered, and in that moment, everything she had feared became a grim reality. She was completely powerless. Asher's face, once so familiar, now looked like a stranger to her. His expression was cold, almost detached, as if this moment were just another routine, just another way to assert his control over her. There was no love in his eyes, no trace of the man she had once thought she knew. Isla's vision blurred further as she fought for breath, her strength fading. Her hands fell from his wrists, unable to hold on any longer. The edges of her vision began to darken, her consciousness slipping away. Asher's grip never loosened. Finally, with a final, desperate gasp, Isla's body went limp, and the world went silent. It wasn't until the following morning that the reality of what had happened began to unfold. The house was eerily quiet, the air thick with the aftermath of violence. Asher had returned to his usual routine, as though nothing had happened. He dressed for work, barely sparing a glance at Isla's lifeless body sprawled across the floor. His detachment was chilling, as if he had no concept of the gravity of his actions. But it didn't take long for the consequences of his actions to catch up with him. The police were called after a concerned neighbor reported hearing strange sounds coming from the house the night before. When officers arrived, they found Isla's body, lifeless and pale, the marks around her neck clear evidence of the brutality she had endured. Asher was immediately taken into custody. His face remained an emotionless mask as he was escorted from the house, the weight of his actions now becoming clear. The shock of his crime reverberated through the community. How could someone who seemed so composed, so in control, be capable of such violence? But the truth was undeniable. Asher had killed Isla, his wife, in the most brutal way possible by choking the life out of her. The person he had sworn to protect had become nothing more than a possession, someone to control, and in his twisted sense of entitlement, he had taken her life without a second thought. The trial that followed was a media sensation. Asher, once a respected figure in the community, was now the face of a horrific tragedy. His defense tried to claim that the death was accidental, a result of a domestic argument that escalated out of control, but the evidence told a different story. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death: manual strangulation. The marks on Isla's neck, the bruising, were consistent with the actions of someone who intended to kill. In the end, Asher was convicted of murder. His life, once filled with power and control, had been shattered by his own hand. He was sentenced to life in prison, a fate that seemed almost too light for the brutality he had inflicted on Isla. Her family, still reeling from the loss of their daughter, could never fully heal from the pain. Isla's tragic end had been the culmination of years of emotional and physical abuse, a marriage that had promised love but had only delivered suffering. Asher's arrest and conviction brought some sense of justice, but it could never bring Isla back. The life she had lost, the dreams she had once held, were gone forever. And in the silence that followed, the world mourned the life of a woman who had been silenced too soon.